No one laughed now. The smile on Evan Sloane's face stayed in place for a second too long, like it had forgotten how to leave, while Claire Bennett, seated 3 chairs down with a legal pad open beside her tablet, lifted her eyes from Naomi to the screen and then back again. Richard Whitmore did not speak. He only turned his chair a fraction toward the projection, and that small movement changed the room more than shouting could have. Naomi could feel it in the air. The executives who had dismissed her a moment ago were suddenly listening for permission from the only man who mattered. The suite was too cold. The air conditioning whispered through hidden vents above the ceiling. Somewhere near the far wall, the ice in a water glass cracked with a tiny sound like a warning. Naomi set the coffee pot down on the service cart before her hand betrayed the tremor she could feel building in her wrist. Her heartbeat was steady in her throat, not wild, not panicked, just present, like a fist knocking once from the inside. Richard's gaze stayed on the screen. Page 47, he said at last. He did not look at her when he said it. Claire moved first. She slid the thick acquisition binder toward herself, her manicured fingers turning pages with quick, precise motions until the paper stopped where Naomi said it would. Evan leaned forward almost immediately. "This is unnecessary," he said, light, dismissive, practiced. The adjustment schedule was already reviewed by outside counsel. Claire did not answer him. Her eyes were moving now, left to right, then back again, the way a person reads something twice when they wish it were simpler than it is. Richard held out his hand. She passed the binder to him without a word. Naomi saw his jaw tighten as he read. He was a man used to skimming details because entire departments existed to protect him from mistakes. That habit was gone now. He read slowly. On the screen above him, the polished charts still promised expansion, market advantage, and clean upside. But on the paper in his hand another story was beginning to surface, one line at a time. Evan gave a short breath through his nose. The liability language is standard for a transaction this size. Naomi looked at him then, really looked at him, and noticed how his cuff was slightly twisted, how a bead of sweat had appeared near his temple despite the cold room, how his confidence had begun to sound like repetition instead of certainty. "No, sir," she said quietly. Every head turned back to her. "It is standard only if the debt table and indemnity schedule match. They do not." The words landed flat and clean, not dramatic, not emotional. That made them harder to brush aside. Claire's brows drew together. She pulled the digital version of the file onto her tablet and expanded a footnote at the bottom of the page. "Richard," she said, and her voice was different now, tighter, stripped of politeness. "The rollover amount in Schedule C is 12% higher than the debt disclosed in the summary model." No one moved. Richard looked up from the binder to the screen, then back down again. "How much?" he asked. Claire did not answer right away. She was calculating, tapping figures into her tablet with the quick, silent rhythm of someone who knew that once a number was spoken aloud, the room would never return to what it had been. Naomi stood still beside the service cart, the scent of roasted coffee rising around her, and thought suddenly of nights at her kitchen table in Newark, textbooks spread open under a weak overhead bulb, her mother asleep in the next room after a double hospital shift, Naomi circling accounting problems in red pen because numbers felt honest even when people did not. Claire looked up. $206 million in assumed exposure by the end of the first quarter, she said. Richard Whitmore set the binder down with deliberate care. Not a slam, not a scene, just enough force to let everyone hear the weight of it. Then, for the first time since Naomi spoke, he turned all the way toward her, and the expression in his pale eyes was no longer annoyance. It was recognition, unwilling and unmistakable, like a man watching a locked door swing open after he had spent years walking past it. For 3 long seconds, nobody spoke. The skyline beyond the glass looked pale now, washed in the thin silver light of late afternoon, but inside the suite the air had thickened into something heavier than silence. Richard Whitmore kept his eyes on Naomi as if he were trying to place her in a world where she did not belong. Not because she lacked composure, but because the room had already decided what category she fit into before she ever opened her mouth. Naomi knew that look. She had seen versions of it in elevators, in hotel corridors, in interview rooms where people smiled at her resume gap before they dismissed it. But this one carried something new beneath the disbelief. It carried doubt. Not about her. About everyone else at the table. Evan Sloan recovered first. Men like him always did. He adjusted his tie, leaned back with studied ease, and gave the kind of chuckle designed to make panic sound unreasonable. A discrepancy is not the same as exposure, he said. Claire is reading a worst-case scenario from an incomplete schedule. Claire did not look at him. Her tablet cast a cool rectangle of light across her face as she scrolled through the appendix again, slower now, checking what she had already found, because careful people did not enjoy being right about dangerous things. Richard turned from Naomi to Evan. "Did you see this before today?" he asked. The question was not loud. It did not need to be. Evan spread his hands slightly, smooth and measured. "The data room has been updated repeatedly for 72 hours. There were late adjustments from the seller. My team reviewed the final model this morning." Richard said nothing. He only held the silence there, and silence, Naomi had learned, was one of the few things richer than money in rooms like this. It forced people to keep talking until truth began to show. Evan did exactly that. "With respect, Richard, we are getting distracted by a staff member who happened to notice two figures without understanding the broader structure." Naomi felt every eye drift back toward her, waiting to see whether she would shrink now that she had been named for what they thought she was. Staff member. Housekeeping. Background. She rested her fingertips against the steel edge of the service card and answered before Richard could. Then the broader structure should make the figures safer, not worse. Evan smiled without warmth. "And you know that because?" Naomi met his gaze. "Because deferred liabilities do not disappear, because someone hides them in a waterfall provision." The words fell cleanly into the room. Claire stopped scrolling. One of the junior analysts near the far end of the table actually looked up from his laptop, startled in that honest way younger people sometimes were when the smartest sentence in the room came from the person everyone had ignored. Richard shifted in his chair. "How do you know what a waterfall provision is?" he asked. Naomi hesitated, not from shame, but because some truths always felt small when spoken aloud, no matter how hard they had once mattered. She looked at the binder in his hand, then at the glowing numbers on the screen. "I studied accounting at Rutgers," she said. "I left in my senior year when my mother got sick. After that, tuition was not the urgent bill anymore." No one moved. The room did not soften, but it changed. Even the men who had smirked before now seemed unsure where to rest their faces. Richard glanced down at the Maid uniform, the pressed collar, the name tag pinned above Naomi's heart, and something unreadable passed through his expression, not pity, not yet apology, but the first fracture in certainty. Claire tapped her screen twice and said, very quietly, "Richard, there is more." Every head turned to her. The debt transfer clause was modified at 11:42 last night. The metadata shows a manual revision after outside counsel sent the approved version. The silence returned, sharper this time. Naomi watched Evan Sloan go still, and in the polished reflection of the dark conference table, she saw what the room saw a second later. For the first time all afternoon, the man who had mocked her looked afraid. The silence after Claire's words did not feel empty. It felt crowded, packed with the sound of people thinking too fast and speaking not at all. Evan Sloan sat with one hand resting near his leather portfolio, his wedding band catching the cold overhead light, his face composed in that expensive, disciplined way men practiced when they had built careers on appearing unshaken. But Naomi saw the difference now. A few minutes earlier he had owned the room with ease. Now he was holding himself inside it. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair and folded the binder closed with deliberate care, his thumb still marking the page as if he did not trust the numbers to stay where they were without pressure. "Manual revision," he said, repeating Claire's words as though testing their shape. "After outside counsel. Signed off." Claire nodded once. "Yes." Her voice was low, measured, but there was steel under it now. The final approved version and the version loaded into this room are not identical. One of the junior analysts near the windows stopped typing altogether. Another looked from Evan to Claire and then to Richard, his face drained of the easy alertness young men brought into boardrooms when they believed deals were just puzzles waiting to be solved by smarter adults. Richard turned his head slightly toward Evan. "Explain that." Evan did not answer right away. He took a sip of water instead, buying 2 seconds, maybe 3. The glass clicked softly when he set it down. "I would be careful with assumptions," he said. "Metadata can reflect clerical handling, formatting transfers, Document consolidation. We are in the middle of a live transaction, Richard. Late-stage edits happen. Not after legal approval, Claire said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The certainty in it was worse. Evan looked at her then, and Naomi caught something hard flash through his expression before it vanished behind professionalism. Unless legal reviewed the wrong version, he said. That moved through the room like a draft under a door. Not enough to knock anything over, just enough to make everyone aware the temperature had changed again. Richard's gaze stayed fixed on him. Did they? Claire's fingers moved over her tablet, pulling up the comparison log, her polished nails making small dry taps against the glass. No. The file sent to legal yesterday afternoon matches the version marked approved. This one does not. Naomi stood beside the service cart without shifting her weight. The cart smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh linen. Beneath that, coffee had begun to cool, losing its richness. She could feel the texture of the metal edge under her fingertips, smooth from years of handling. And in some distant quiet part of herself, she noticed how strange it was that the thing keeping her steady in a room full of billion-dollar panic was a housekeeping cart. Evan smiled then, but there was no room left for charm in it. So now we are conducting an internal investigation because a maid and a metadata trail made everyone nervous? Richard stood up. The motion was not dramatic. It was controlled, precise, and because of that it landed harder than anger would have. Chairs seemed to shrink around the table. The skyline behind him had darkened another shade, the first early lights blinking on across Midtown like watchful eyes. No, Richard said. We are stopping a deal because the woman you dismissed saw what my finance team missed. My legal team confirmed it. And you still sound more offended than concerned. No one breathed loudly after that. No one even moved their papers. Naomi watched the words reach the table one face at a time. She saw embarrassment settle over some of them, calculation over others. Evan's jaw tightened. For a second, he looked as if he wanted to answer with the old confidence, the old smooth certainty. But whatever sentence had risen in him seemed to die before it reached his mouth. Richard turned toward the wall screen. Take Project Alder down, he said. One of the assistants fumbled for the remote. The glowing financial slide vanished, leaving only the reflection of the room in the black screen. A room full of expensive people staring at themselves. Then Richard looked at Naomi again, and this time there was nothing dismissive in it at all. Do not leave, he said quietly. Not yet. Naomi did not answer right away. The words hung between her and Richard Whitmore with a strange weight, because only minutes earlier he had told her to stay silent, and now the same man was asking her, without quite admitting it, to remain in the very room he had tried to push her out of. She gave a small nod. Nothing more. The service cart stood beside her like a witness, its chrome frame catching the dim reflection of the recessed lights above, the folded napkins still untouched, the coffee cooling in porcelain cups no one remembered wanting anymore. Richard turned back to the table. Everyone except Claire stays seated, he said. Then he looked toward the assistants near the side wall. No documents leave this room. No calls to the cellar. No one sends a message until I say so. The commands came clipped and low, but the room responded instantly. Phones were lowered. Laptops stopped moving. Even the younger analysts seemed to understand that something larger than a bad deal had just broken open in front of them. Claire Bennett slid her tablet closer and began building a side-by-side comparison of the approved file and the version. Loaded for signature, her face composed, her shoulders tight. Evan Sloan did not sit back anymore. He stayed slightly forward, elbows near the edge of the table, as if posture alone might hold the moment together. Richard, he said, choosing caution now over charm. Freezing communications in the middle of a live transaction will raise alarms. We need to manage this carefully. Richard did not look at him. You should be relieved I am still using the word manage. The reply was quiet enough that no one could mistake it for theater. Naomi felt the room absorb it. She also felt every eye drift toward her again, not mocking now, not dismissive, but measuring. People always wanted the invisible to stay invisible until the invisible saw something important. Then suddenly everyone wanted a biography. Richard finally faced her fully. How did you catch it that fast? He asked. Naomi looked at the dark screen where the deal summary had been moments earlier. Without the glowing charts, the room felt stripped down, almost honest. Because the adjustment line was too clean, she said. Real debt does not disappear between one page and the next. It changes shape, but it does not disappear. One of the junior analysts blinked like he had just been handed a sentence he would remember for years. Claire glanced up from her tablet, interested despite herself. Richard folded his arms. You saw that while serving coffee. I saw enough to know the story on the screen and the story in the binder were not telling the same truth. Naomi kept her voice level. She was aware of her uniform, the starch at her cuffs, the slight ache in her feet from 10 hours on shift, the scent of polish still clinging to her sleeves from cleaning brass elevator trim earlier that afternoon. She was also aware that if she sounded angry, they would hear attitude, and if she sounded afraid, they would hear weakness. So she gave them neither. Evan let out a breath that almost passed for a laugh. A gift for intuition does not qualify anyone to audit a transaction. Claire answered before Naomi could. This is not intuition. The indemnity cross-reference was altered to support a debt number that does not belong in the approved structure. She turned the tablet so Richard could see. In 2 neat columns, marked in red and gray, the revisions glowed like cuts beneath bright light. A date stamp sat in the corner. A user credential sat beside it. The room went still all over again. Richard read the name attached to the revision history, and this time when he lifted his eyes to Evan Sloan, there was no confusion left in them at all. Only a hard, clarifying disappointment, the kind that arrives when betrayal stops being a suspicion and becomes a line of text on a screen. For a moment, Evan Sloan did not look at the screen. He looked at Richard Whitmore instead, as if years of proximity to power might still count for more than whatever cold evidence Claire had laid in front of them. Then he glanced down at the tablet, and the shift in his face was small but undeniable, the kind of shift that only showed when a man realized denial had become harder than the truth. The room had gone so quiet that Naomi could hear the faint mechanical hum from the recessed lights above the conference table and, farther out, the thin hollow whistle of wind slipping around the corners of the tower. Manhattan was turning to evening beyond the glass now. Headlights streamed down the avenues in bright patient lines. The suite, with its dark wood, polished stone, and leather chairs, no longer felt like a place built for confidence. It felt like a vault that had just opened. Richard kept his gaze on Evan. Say something useful, he said. Evan straightened, but not with the easy grace he had worn all afternoon. This time it looked assembled, piece by piece. I can explain the revision, he said. There was pressure from the seller to keep the deal from collapsing. The adjustment was meant to create flexibility until we rebalanced the structure after closing. Claire's eyes lifted slowly from the tablet. That is not flexibility, she said. That is undisclosed exposure. Evan gave a brittle smile. Only if you insist on reading it with the most hostile possible interpretation. Naomi saw Richard's hand flatten on the table. Not a strike. Not anger for display. Just a man grounding himself against something that had already become expensive in more ways than one. You revised a legal schedule after approval, Richard said. You loaded it into a signature meeting. You never told me. And now you want to debate tone. No. One at the table looked away. Even the assistants near the wall had stopped pretending to organize papers. Naomi remained where she was, beside the service cart, feeling the dull ache in her arches, the press of her uniform shoes, the cool air against the back of her neck where a few loose strands of hair had slipped from her bun. She did not belong at that table. Everyone in the room had made that clear. But the room had also spent the last 20 minutes proving how little belonging had to do with seeing clearly. Richard turned toward Claire. How bad is it if we had signed? Claire exhaled once and set the tablet down flat. Best case, you spend months in litigation trying to unwind the liability transfer. Worst case, you inherit the debt, the seller walks clean, and the market reads it as negligence on our side. The financial loss would be severe. The reputational loss might be worse. One of the younger analysts swallowed hard. Another shut his laptop with slow, careful hands, as though even closing it too fast might worsen the damage already hanging in the room. Richard nodded once, absorbing it, then looked toward Naomi. The attention unsettled the others more than it did her. You saved us from signing it, he said. The sentence landed softly, but the softness gave it weight. Naomi did not step forward. She did not lower her eyes either. I pointed to the mistake, she said. Your team confirmed it. Richard held her gaze a second longer than necessary. Maybe because he was not just hearing her now. Maybe because he was hearing himself from earlier, the command to stay silent, and measuring it against the woman standing in front of him with coffee cooling at her side and truth still steady in her voice. Evan pushed back his chair then, not abruptly, just enough to remind the room he still knew how to move inside it. Richard, before this turns theatrical, I think it would be wise to discuss next steps privately. Richard did not even glance at him. Sit down. Evan stopped. The words were quiet, but final. Outside, the last light slipped off the glass towers across the avenue, leaving the city in blue-gray shadow and electric gold. Inside, Naomi watched Richard Whitmore reach for the binder again, open it to page 47, and read the line she had read in seconds as though he were trying to understand not only the numbers, but the blindness that had let them get this far. Richard read the clause again, slower this time, his finger resting beneath the line where the liability language curved away from the clean promise of the executive summary and into something colder, something designed to survive a rushed signature and pass for routine. Naomi could see the exact moment it settled inside him. Not the math, the betrayal. Numbers could be repaired. A balance sheet could recover. But trust, once it turned on you in your own boardroom, left a different kind of damage. He closed the binder and lifted his head. Claire, call internal compliance. I want forensic review on every version of this file and every message tied to the revision chain. Claire gave a single nod and reached for her phone, but Richard stopped her with a look. Not from the hallway. From here. That changed the room again. Whatever remained of privacy disappeared with that sentence. Naomi watched it move across the table, the quiet understanding that no one was being trusted with distance anymore. Evan Sloan stood very still, one hand resting near the back of his chair, his face composed with the effort of a man trying not to look cornered while the walls kept inching closer. You are overcorrecting, he said. This can still be handled discreetly. Richard's expression did not change. Discreetly is how it got into my signature packet. Claire dialed. Her voice, when she spoke to compliance, was crisp and unadorned, stripped down to facts and access requests. Names. Timestamps. Document control. Naomi listened without appearing to listen, the way years in hotels had taught her to do. Powerful people always assumed service workers faded into the walls. They forgot that walls heard everything. One of the junior analysts cleared his throat softly. Sir, he said to Richard, there is one more thing. Everyone looked at him. He swallowed, then turned his laptop so the screen faced the table. The revision was pushed from Mr. Sloan's credentials, but the seller's side opened the amended schedule 4 minutes later. The glow from the screen lit the underside of his jaw. They were expecting it. No one breathed for a second. Claire ended her call and stepped closer to the laptop. Richard did not move. He did not need to. The stillness in him had become heavier than motion. Evan's voice came out sharper now, the polish starting to split. That proves nothing except they had access to a working draft. Naomi looked at him and thought how strange fear was on certain people. On some it made them small. On others it made them louder. Richard finally rose from his chair again, and this time the movement carried a finality that pushed even the air back a little. You are done explaining what this is not, he said. Start explaining what it is. Evan's jaw tightened. The skyline behind Richard had deepened to navy, the first interior lights in neighboring towers glowing warm behind glass, while this room, with its cold downlights and dark table, felt harder by the minute. Naomi became suddenly aware of the ache in her shoulders, the long day sitting in her bones, the faint lemon scent from the linen on the cart beside her, and beneath all of it the old reflex to leave before anyone remembered who she was supposed to be in a room like this. She shifted one step back. Richard noticed. Miss Brooks, he said, and the use of her name made several people at the table glance toward her as if it were somehow more shocking than the fraud. Stay. She stopped. For a moment she said nothing. Then she gave the smallest nod. Claire straightened and looked from the laptop to Richard. Compliance wants everyone in this room preserved on record until they arrive. Evan let out a low breath through his nose. You cannot be serious. Richard's eyes never left him. That is the second time today you have mistaken my calm for hesitation. The room went silent again. Naomi stood beside the service cart, hands still, back straight, while the chilled air moved softly across her cuffs. Just an hour ago, she had been another black maid pouring coffee for people who did not see her. Now she was the only reason the truth in that room still had a voice. The wait for compliance stretched the room thinner than any argument had. Nobody checked the time out loud, but everyone felt it in the slow drift of the city beyond the glass, and in the way the cold coffee sat untouched beside legal pads and polished phones. Naomi remained beside the service cart, still enough to disappear if anyone allowed themselves the comfort of old habits. Yet the room could not return to those habits now. Too much had already been said. Too much had already been proven. Claire Bennett stood near the end of the table with one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, her tablet glowing in the dimness as she reviewed document history, access logs, and transmission trails with the calm severity of someone who no longer needed to guess where the problem lived. Richard Whitmore had not sat down again. He stood at the head of the table, one palm against the leather chair he had left behind, looking not at the skyline, not at the people who worked for him, but at the chain of decisions that had almost turned his signature into a confession of negligence. Evan Sloan tried once more to sound reasonable. Richard, if compliance walks in before we frame this correctly, you create a record that can spread well beyond this room. Richard turned his head only slightly. A record already exists. That is the problem. The reply ended there. No flourish, no raised voice, just a clean sentence that left nowhere soft to land. Naomi felt the familiar instinct to lower her gaze, not because she was ashamed, but because rooms built on hierarchy had a way of punishing eye contact from the wrong person. Still, she kept her eyes level. She had come too far into the truth to retreat into politeness now. One of the younger analysts, the same one who had found the cellar access log, looked toward her with open curiosity. "Miss Brooks," he said carefully, as if trying to learn the shape of her name before using it. "When you saw the slide, what exactly gave it away first?" The question changed the air in a quieter way than the accusations had. It was the first question in the room that did not sound like defense. Naomi answered without stepping forward. "The timing assumption," she said. The debt adjustment was delayed on the summary slide as if the liability would settle later, but the clause in the binder pulled exposure forward. When those two things disagree, one of them is lying. The analyst glanced at his screen, then back at her, and slowly nodded, the way students did when a concept finally turned from abstract to obvious. Claire looked up from her tablet. "She's right. The summary was built to calm the eye. The clause was built to survive the signature." No one missed the difference. Even the assistants by the wall seemed to hold themselves differently now, less like furniture, more like witnesses. A soft knock came at the suite door. Every face turned. The sound was gentle, almost polite, but it landed like a gavel. Claire crossed the carpet first and opened the door to two compliance officers in dark suits with company badges clipped neatly at the waist. They stepped in carrying thin laptops and the quiet seriousness of people who entered rooms after trust had already failed. Richard gestured toward the table. "Everything stays in place," he said. "All devices remain where they are. Start with document access and transmission history." One of the officers nodded and began setting up near Claire. The other asked for names, positions, and device assignments. When he reached Naomi, there was the smallest pause as his eyes dropped to her uniform, then lifted again. Richard answered before the man could decide where to file her. Miss Naomi Brooks identified the discrepancy that stopped execution of the agreement, he said. The officer looked at Naomi differently after that. Not kindly, not dramatically, just accurately. It was such a rare thing that for a second it unsettled her more than the insult earlier had. Accuracy had its own brightness. Evan shifted in his seat, his composure wearing thinner by the minute, while Richard remained standing in the cool light at the head of the table, and Naomi understood, with a clarity almost as sharp as the numbers that had betrayed the deal, that the room had finally begun to see the difference between status and value. The compliance officers worked with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that panic only helped the guilty. One connected to the conference room display and began pulling server-side access logs onto the dark screen, while the other moved from seat to seat, collecting device identifications, message timestamps, and file transfer history with careful, neutral questions. No one interrupted him. Even Evan Sloan had stopped trying to control the room with tone alone. He sat with his shoulders squared and his expression polished into something almost calm, but Naomi could see the strain collecting around his mouth now, the tiny delay before each answer, the way his fingers stayed too close to his phone without ever touching it. Richard Whitmore remained standing at the head of the table, his suit jacket still buttoned, his face unreadable in the cold, reflected light of the monitor. Claire Bennett stood beside the compliance team, reviewing each line as it appeared, her posture straight, her focus absolute. The first set of logs showed the approved legal file sent to outside counsel at 4:18 the previous afternoon. The second showed the revised schedule uploaded into the signature packet at 11:42 the night before. The third caused the room to tighten all over again. A secure transfer had gone out from Evan Sloan's credentials to an external address at 11:46, for minutes after the revision. One of the compliance officers enlarged the line item. The room watched the sender field, the timestamp, the encrypted destination tag. Claire exhaled slowly. That destination is tied to Alder Ridge Advisors, she said. The seller's restructuring consultant. Nobody spoke after that. The city outside had gone fully dark now, a spread of white office lights and red brake lights beneath the glass. But inside the suite, every face seemed washed in the same flat shade of disbelief. Richard did not explode. That was what unsettled the room most. He only asked, why would my chief financial officer send a revised internal liability schedule to the seller's restructuring consultant minutes before execution? Evan finally looked not at Richard, not at Claire, but across the table toward Naomi, as if some part of him still resented the fact that all of this existed because she had noticed what he thought would stay buried. Then he answered Richard. Because the deal needed to close, he said. You wanted speed. The seller wanted certainty. I created room to finish what everyone in this company said they wanted. Richard's face did not move. By transferring $200 million of hidden risk onto my firm. Evan leaned forward. By protecting the strategic value of the acquisition. Claire's voice cut in, calm and exact. No. By protecting the seller from its own debt profile and concealing the shift long enough to force execution. One of the compliance officers asked, did anyone authorize Mr. Sloan to amend legal terms after approval? Silence answered first. Then Richard said, no one. The word landed. Like stone. Naomi stood by the service cart, the chilled metal against her fingertips, the faint smell of lemon cleanser and stale coffee rising around her, and felt something inside the room change again. This was no longer about whether a mistake had been made. It was about whether conscience had entered before the signature or after. The younger analyst who had spoken earlier stared at the screen as if it had aged him. One of the assistants near the wall lowered her eyes, perhaps out of discomfort, perhaps out of shame for having laughed when Naomi first spoke. Richard finally turned toward Naomi, and this time there was no distance left in the gesture. Miss Brooks, he said, his voice quieter now, almost grave. When you saw the slide and the binder did not match, you spoke anyway. Naomi held his gaze. Yes, sir. Richard looked back at the glowing evidence on the screen, then at the people seated around his table, and something heavy seemed to settle into his shoulders, not defeat, but recognition. Then you had more integrity in one sentence than this room had all afternoon. The sentence did not vanish after Richard said it. It stayed in the room, resting on the polished table, on the darkened screen, on the lowered faces of people who had spent the afternoon trusting titles more than truth. Naomi felt it too. Not as triumph, but as a strange and unfamiliar stillness, the kind that comes when something long ignored is finally named out loud. Evan Sloan gave a short, humorless breath and leaned back in his chair for the first time in several minutes, as though he had decided that dignity was now his last negotiable asset. Integrity does not close transactions, he said. It does not calm investors. It does not protect valuation when a strategic acquisition is hanging by a thread. Richard turned toward him with the slow precision of a man who no longer needed to raise his voice to make a room listen. No, he said. It only protects everything that still matters after the transaction is over. Nobody moved. One of the compliance officers typed steadily, documenting each exchange, while the other requested access to Evan's company phone and laptop. The request was delivered politely, but the politeness of procedure had a finality that argument could not soften. Evan looked at the devices in front of him as if they had become someone else's property already. Then, with visible care, he slid them across the table. The small sound they made against the polished wood seemed louder than it should have. Claire Bennett watched the handoff, then returned her attention to the comparison file. "There is another revision note embedded in the document comments," she said. It was hidden from print view. One of the compliance officers enlarged the text on the display. A line of internal notation appeared in pale gray against the black screen, short and clinical, but devastating in its plainness. "Move exposure forward after execution. Clean up disclosure in supplemental reporting." The room changed all over again. Even those who had already accepted the betrayal seemed to recoil from seeing intention written so clearly. Naomi felt the back of her neck go cold. There was something uniquely chilling about fraud when it stopped pretending to be complexity. Richard stared at the comment for a long moment. "Who wrote that?" he asked. The officer checked the audit trail. It was inserted from Mr. Sloane's credentials at 11:44 last night. Evan closed his eyes once, not dramatically, just briefly, like a man discovering that every door he had counted on had finally locked. When he opened them again, the polish was gone. What remained was sharper, more tired, and in some ways more honest than anything he had said all day. "You were going to lose the deal," he said to Richard. The seller was desperate, but not desperate enough to accept the original structure. They wanted protection. They wanted certainty. You wanted speed, market expansion, and a victory before quarter end. "I gave all of you the version that got signed." Claire's expression hardened. "At the cost of deceiving your own firm." Evan looked at her with open irritation. "At the cost of getting it done." "There is a difference between ideal governance and real transactions, Claire." Naomi heard a quiet sound near the wall and realized one of the assistants had let out a breath she had probably been holding for 20 minutes. Richard remained still at the head of the table, but Naomi could see the effort in that stillness now. Not anger alone. Disgust. Disappointment. The ache of recognizing that rot had not come from outside his company, but from the polished center of it. He glanced toward the black window where Manhattan glowed in scattered gold and white, then back to the table. "The deal is dead," he said. "Effective now." Evan's face tightened. "You are making an emotional decision." Richard shook his head once. "No. I made the emotional decision earlier, when I almost signed because I trusted the wrong man and dismissed the right one." The words landed with a different kind of force because they did not stop at Evan. They reached Naomi too. For the first time since she spoke, Richard Whitmore was not only confronting what had nearly happened to his company. He was confronting what he had nearly done to her. The room did not relax when Richard declared the deal dead. If anything, the air seemed to tighten around the words, as though every polished surface in the suite had absorbed their finality and was now reflecting it back at the people seated there. The compliance officers continued their work without interruption, documenting devices, preserving files, building a record that would outlast anyone's attempt to explain this night into something cleaner than it was. Claire Bennett stood beside them, one hand lightly braced against the table, her tablet dark now, her attention no longer on discovery, but on consequence. Evan Sloane sat in silence, the kind that was no longer strategic. It was the silence of a man who had run out of better versions of himself to present. Naomi remained beside the service card, feeling the seam of her sleeve against her wrist, the old ache in her lower back from hours on her feet, the quiet cold of the room pressing through the thin fabric of her uniform. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt watchful, as if the truth, having finally surfaced, might still find a way to be buried by people with more money than shame. Richard seemed to understand that risk too. He looked to compliance and said, "Suspend Mr. Sloane's access to all internal systems effective immediately. Notify building security and executive administration before he leaves this floor." The officer nearest him nodded and typed the instruction into the log. Evan let out a slow breath and looked at Richard with something close to disbelief. "After 21 years, he said, "this is how you end it." Richard's expression did not soften. "After 21 years, this is how you chose to end it." The answer had no heat in it. That was what made it devastating. Naomi watched Evan absorb it, and for a second she saw not the architect of a near disaster, not the polished executive who had mocked her in front of the room, but simply a man discovering that power could evaporate faster than he had ever imagined. Then the moment passed. Claire picked up a printed copy of the altered schedule and slid it into a compliance evidence sleeve with careful hands. The plastic made a faint crisp sound that seemed to cut the room in half. One side was what these people had believed themselves to be at the start of the afternoon. The other was what remained after proof. A phone on the far side of the table vibrated once, then again. No one reached for it. The city beyond the windows had fully surrendered to night now. Towers lit like stacked constellations, traffic moving below in rivers of red and white. Naomi caught her reflection in the black glass for an instant. A dark figure in a maid's uniform standing inside a room built for wealth, and thought how absurd it was that Truth had come to this table wearing practical shoes and carrying coffee. Richard turned then, not to the officers, not to Claire, not to the men who had spent the afternoon speaking in numbers and strategy, but to Naomi. The room noticed. Of course it did. Rooms like this always noticed when attention crossed the lines they depended on. "Miss Brooks," he said, and his voice had changed. It was not warm exactly. Richard Whitmore did not strike Naomi as a man fluent in warmth. But the hardness had shifted. Something in it had opened enough to let humility through. "I told you to stay silent." Naomi met his eyes and said nothing. He continued anyway. "I was wrong." No one moved. Even compliance paused for half a heartbeat before continuing to type. Richard looked briefly at the service cart beside her, at the untouched cups, the folded linen, the evidence of the role she had been expected to play, then back at her face. "You spoke when it would have been easier and safer not to. You protected this company when the people paid to protect it failed." Naomi felt every gaze in the suite turn toward her, but this time, the weight of it was different. Not ridicule, not skepticism. Recognition, awkward and overdue. She could have made the moment larger. She could have said something sharp, something deserved, something that would have made the room feel the full shape of its own blindness. Instead, she answered in the same quiet voice that had stopped the deal in the first place. "I only said what was true." Richard lowered his eyes once, just briefly, and when he looked up again the shame in him was no longer hidden. "That," he said, "was more than the rest of us managed to do." Something in the room eased after Naomi said it. Not because the problem had disappeared, but because truth, once spoken without performance, had a way of making everyone else's excuses sound tired. Richard Whitmore stood in that small silence as though he did not quite know what to do with a kind of honesty that could not be purchased, scheduled, or delegated. Around him, the machinery of consequence kept moving. Compliance sealed evidence sleeves, copied audit logs, and issued access suspensions with the plain, mechanical precision of process doing what pride never could. Claire Bennett closed her tablet at last and let out a breath that seemed to belong to the last hour rather than the last second. Evan Sloan remained seated, no longer arguing, no longer persuading, his face emptied of strategy. The room had moved beyond persuasion. Naomi could feel the long shift in her body now, the soreness behind her knees, the pull in her shoulders, the faint imprint the apron ties had left against her waist. She had started the afternoon polishing brass in the private hallway outside the suite. She had expected to end it the same way, quietly, invisibly, with a cart full of empty cups and no reason for anyone to remember her name. Instead, she was standing at the center of a reckoning she had never asked to enter. Richard took one slow step away from the head of the table and, for the first time all evening, seemed less like a man presiding over a company than a man trying to account for himself. "Miss Brooks," he said, and the room stilled again, because his tone no longer carried command. It carried intent. "What floor are you assigned to?" The question startled several people at the table more than it startled Naomi. She answered simply, "Private executive level, sir. 37th through 39th. Richard nodded once, absorbing not just the answer but the fact that a woman trusted to maintain the highest floors of his building had apparently been considered unworthy of a voice inside them. He turned to Claire. "Effective tomorrow morning, I want Human Resources and Executive Administration to meet with Miss Brooks before her shift begins." A few heads lifted. Richard continued before surprise could turn into interpretation. "Review her employment status, educational background, and any records relevant to financial training. If she is willing, I want options prepared by noon. Tuition support, analyst apprenticeship, whatever is appropriate and real, not symbolic." The last two words changed the shape of the offer. They stripped it of charity and made it what it should have been from the beginning, recognition. Naomi felt the room look at her again, but this time not as an interruption or an exception, more as a correction. Claire's expression softened by a degree so slight it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying attention. I will handle it personally, she said. Naomi did not answer immediately. Gratitude came too easily in rooms where people expected it from those beneath them. She had learned that young. Gratitude could be demanded before fairness was even offered. So she chose her words with care. Thank you, she said. But I do not want a favor because tonight went badly for someone else. Richard met her eyes. It is not a favor, he said. It is a correction that should have happened long before tonight. No one challenged him. No one even looked tempted. Somewhere near the wall, one of the assistants quietly gathered the untouched coffee cups from the edge of the credenza, then seemed to think better of it, and stopped, as if even small routines felt inappropriate until the larger one had been repaired. Naomi glanced at the service cart beside her, the folded linen still perfect, the silver pot gone lukewarm, the tools of a role she had carried with dignity because dignity was hers, not the job's. Richard followed her glance and then looked back at her. You came in here to serve coffee, he said, almost to himself. And you ended up protecting everyone at this table from the cost of our own arrogance. Naomi held his gaze, calm and steady, while the city lights burned behind the glass like distant stars. No, sir, she said softly. I protected the truth. The rest was your choice. By the time compliance finished preserving the last device and sealing the final evidence sleeve, the suite no longer looked like the room where the afternoon had begun. The legal pads were crooked. The coffee had gone cold. The black display screen reflected tired faces instead of clean projections, and the expensive confidence that had once filled the space had thinned into something quieter, something more honest. One by one, people rose when they were told to rise. Assistants gathered their things with careful hands. Junior analysts stepped into the hallway speaking in low voices, not because they had secrets left, but because the night had taught them what noise could cost. Evan Sloan was escorted out without spectacle, without argument, the sort of exit that carried more weight precisely because no one tried to make it dramatic. Claire Bennett remained behind for a final moment, reviewing the compliance summary with the last officer at the table. Richard Whitmore signed nothing. He only watched, nodded once, and let the machinery of consequence complete what his authority had finally begun. Naomi waited beside the service cart until the room had almost emptied. The wheels were angled slightly toward the door, the silver pot still resting on its tray, the folded linen untouched except for the one napkin she had straightened twice without realizing it. Her feet ached. Her shoulders were heavy. The skin at the back of her neck felt cool where the air conditioning had found it hour after hour. She should have been exhausted enough to feel small again. Instead, she felt strangely steady, as if the truth she had spoken had settled into her bones and made room there. Claire closed her folder and approached her first. Human Resources will be expecting you at 9 in the morning, she said. There was no pity in her tone, and Naomi appreciated that more than kindness dressed as sympathy. I will be there as well. Naomi nodded. Thank you. Claire glanced once toward Richard, then back at Naomi. You did not just save a transaction from going bad, she said. You forced a room full of educated people to admit they were not paying attention to the right person. Then she left, heels soft against the carpet, the door closing behind her with a muted click. Silence returned, but not the old kind. This one was gentler. Richard stood near the windows for a moment longer, looking out over Manhattan where the streets below ran in ribbons of white and red and gold. When he finally turned, the hardness that had once made him seem carved out of the building itself was still there, but it no longer felt unreachable. He walked toward Naomi slowly, not as a man approaching staff, not as a billionaire crossing a room he owned, but as someone who had learned, late and painfully, that ownership and worth were not the same thing. He stopped beside the service cart. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Richard reached toward the tray, took one of the cold, untouched coffee cups, and set it back down again with the faintest shake of his head. I almost signed away $200 million because I trusted position more than character, he said quietly. Naomi rested her hand on the cart handle. A lot of people do. He looked at her then, and there was no defense left in his face, only the clean weariness of a man who had seen himself clearly and not liked the view. Not in my building again, he said. Naomi held his gaze. The lights from the city trembled softly in the glass behind him, and somewhere far below, a siren moved through the avenue like a thread of sound pulled through dark cloth. She gave the cart a small push, and the wheels rolled forward with a soft rubber whisper over the carpet. "Good," she said, "because silence is how people sign away the truth." Richard stepped aside to let her pass. No command, no performance, just space. Naomi moved toward the service hallway under the dim amber lights. Her uniform still plain, her shoes still practical, her name tag still pinned above her heart. Nothing about her looked different, and yet everything had changed. Behind her, the boardroom remained full of glass and leather and money. Ahead of her, the narrow corridor smelled faintly of clean linen and floor polish, familiar and real. She pushed the cart into that quiet light without